1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 men are victims of sexual abuse. And these numbers don't highlight the disproportionate numbers of those survivors who don't report, or those survivors who may identify elsewhere on the gender spectrum. This podcast is for all of us, survivors of sexual abuse and assault, who want to experience a life worth living beyond a tragic past. My name is DJ Burr, and I'm a licensed mental health therapist, author, screenwriter, sober person, and I'm a survivor of sexual abuse. I know the complexity of healing from trauma. I also know the joy that comes from the healing process. Hear our stories and share your own. You are not alone. Hello and welcome back to Journey On. Today I am speaking with author Janitta Nichols, author of The Secrets of My Mother. Janitta, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you.
So tell me, what drew you to be interested in coming on Journey On and telling your story?
So I was kind of, in the process after I wrote my book, I just wanted to kind of seek out different platforms that kind of talked about the things that I was talking about in my book. I know that trauma and abuse can be like a taboo conversation for a lot of people. So I wanted to go on some already developed platforms to kind of just talk about my story and have some of those taboo conversations that aren't being had. And as I was searching for a few podcasts and few people that had the boldness and courage to do that, I came across yours. So I was delighted to, just send a request to see if you were interested in having me.
Excellent. Well, I'm so glad that you've come on to Journey On. We don't get a lot of stories from female identified victims or survivors, as I like to call us. And I think we need to hear more of those stories. Yeah. And I think it's really powerful that you're willing to share your story and have published your story, which means you're going to reach a lot of people.
Yeah, I'm excited about that too. It took a lot of courage for me to want to write it down because I lived most of my adult life kind of hiding from my trauma because I didn't want to be identified as a victim. I didn't want people to see me and be like, oh, that's the girl who, went through this. So I kind of just put on this image of, what I felt was normal so that I wasn't identified as that. But I think once I actually confronted my trauma and spoke out about it, I believe that's actually when I became a victor instead of hiding it.
Amen. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So tell us about your story. Where did you grow up? And what kind of things did you experience that got you to the place where you were willing to expose the secrets and set the record straight in terms of your survival?
So I was born in Cincinnati, Ohio. We moved around a lot as kids. So a lot of my childhood, I don't really remember placement, but I do remember when we were about 12 or 13, my mother moved us to Atlanta, Georgia. We moved to Atlanta, Georgia. I spent most of my time there until I turned about 18. Then I went back to Ohio to live with my grandmother. So definitely moved around a lot. And I had my own perception of why we moved around a lot. And most of that, I believe, was my mother wanted to hide some of the things that her husband was doing in our home. He was a really aggressive and angry man. He abused me and my mother, and he just wasn't a good person to be around. And so as I got older, I'm not sure if you can hear my daughter. I'm sorry.
No worries.
Okay.
I have kids. It is COVID time. We're all at home. So no worries whatsoever.
Sorry, I told you it's like as soon as I'm busy, I'm sorry. I deeply apologize for that.
No worries. I think our listeners will totally understand.
Sorry. So yeah, when I believe that as I became an adult, I have 7 other brothers and sisters. I'm the oldest of 8. And my stepfather, he started to abuse me at about the age of 6. And when I was 6 years old, I believe that I was abused by the time I was 17 over 300 times by different men in my family. And I think that the boldness for me to want to speak out was my sister, who was right up under me, was also abused by different men. And a lot of this I didn't know about until I was 16. And if you watch the trailer that I have on my page, I caught him molesting my sister. And at that point, it was kind of like, this ends. Like, I'm not getting ready to continue to allow him to do this to my family. And I stood up for my sister. I got into a huge fight with him. He beat me up pretty bad. And that day, I just contemplated suicide. I felt like my mother wasn't going to protect us because she didn't believe us about the abuse the whole time. Every time we told her, it was like she didn't believe us. I believe she knew it was probably happening. She just didn't want to at the time. And I just felt like I had to do something. And even though I thought about committing suicide, I felt like, well, if I leave, who's going to be here to protect them? Who's going to be here to make sure that this doesn't happen again, to her? So I jumped out the window. I ran and got help. And that day I was able to get the police, and they came back and they arrested him, and they took me and my sister from the home. And so as we got older, I handled the abuse differently than what she did. And not to spell her name out, but my sister became what I believe addicted to like alcohol and pain pills. And she battled depression, and sometimes she still battle it. And the sister who fathered this was, they were being told a different story than what actually happened. So there were people in our family who didn't believe us about the abuse because there was so many different stories and so many different things that was fishing around about what actually happened. And when I saw my mother, even though as a child we didn't get along well, I still cared about her. She was still my mom. And I saw her suffering from the lies that were being told. I said, it's time that I set the record straight. And I felt like me speaking out on the platform that I chose to was nobody but God leading me to do it, because I didn't have the courage to do it. But when I took myself out the equation and I stopped caring about, like, what will people say about me? What will people think about me? Like, I would no longer be seen as this happy, beautiful woman. I'll be now identified as a victim globally. When I stopped caring about that, I realized how important me speaking out was freeing for not only me and my family, but also my children. Because they would be able to see mommy being bold and mommy being courageous and mommy speaking out. And I would be able to break the curse. And I feel like me exposing my trauma, it didn't leave them susceptible to be a victim of trauma, because they understood it and they knew what it was, and they were exposed to it by me telling them and not someone else abusing them.
That's a hard truth to tell.
Yeah.
It really is. What was that process like to sit down and to decide to tell the truth after having lived the secret?
I wish I could say it was like a butterfly, and rainbow process, but it was very excruciating. I've talked about it a lot of times, but I ended up, before I decided to write, I ended up going into, I would believe, one of the worst depressions. I went into a really, really bad dark place and really bad depression, to where, those thoughts, those evil thoughts that continue to come on your mind and remind you of what you've been through and try to get you to identify with those thoughts. So much guilt about decisions that I've made. And I just felt like I wasn't adequate, not only as a person, but as a mother. And then you add that, a traumatized woman trying to operate in a heterosexual relationship, it is hard. It was very hard. So the depression came back so strong because those thoughts were just overtaken for me. And part of my healing process was me to begin to write down some of the things I never told anybody. Write down some of the secrets, write down some of the things that, that I went through. And as I began to write it down, my husband reminded me, like, hey, you remember a couple years ago when God told you he wanted you to write a book about what you had been through. And I was like, I'm not doing that because that doesn't pay my bills.
I know that story. I know that story well.
Yeah, I was like, I'm not going to sit down and waste time writing a book when I could be out looking for another, career. Because we had just moved all the way to Texas, and I left my career, back in Ohio as a police officer. So I was like, no, I'm not gonna sit down and write a book. I'm not gonna do it. And when I began to realize, like, it began a conversation where I was able to talk to people about what I went through and tell them my story, and people were just blown away, like, oh my God, like, you're so strong, you're so courageous. Like, I can't believe you went through that. And I thank you for sharing, because now you're helping me. And when I started to see just that small impact, I was like, well, imagine how many people I can reach if I wrote it down. If I wrote down my story, if I wrote down what happened. But I felt like telling my story is just not enough. I felt like me just telling people what I went through wasn't enough without trying to identify the problem of why it happens. And so when I was able to sit down and like put a lot of thought into stuff and a lot of prayer, I was able to understand first that my mother was a victim of sexual abuse. Her mother was a victim of sexual abuse, and so was her mother. And the common denominator of the problem was they all kept it a secret to
Yep.
protect other people. But when they kept those secrets to protect other people, I feel like the demons that they refused to confront was only passed down for the next generation to try to deal with. And when I did that, God told me, you can't tell your story without first showing the pattern. So you have to tell your mother's story first. Because me even being brought about into this world is a abuse. All the men that was possibly my dad, I had like maybe 4 or 5 possibilities of who could be my father. They were all in their 20s, and my mother was only 14 when she had me.
Oh, goodness.
So when I was able to look at that and say the problem started way before me, it didn't start with me, but it can end with me if I'm willing to do the work. So just sitting down writing my story wasn't enough. I had to go back and find the problem. So leading to the book, The Secrets of My Mother, when I first thought of that title, God gave me that title. It was like, okay, this is a great way to expose my truth. But then when I connected with my mother and I had to learn how to forgive her for the things she didn't do for me, and I sat down to actually listen to her story because I had never done that before. Instead of hating her, I had compassion for her, And when she told me her story, I was like, yo, I got to tell your secrets too. So my book is a series, and the book that's out now is only part 1. And
Oh.
and I had to go back and I had to tell the story of how I even came about. And in the midst of that, telling some of the things that my mother was dealing with. She had parents that were addicted to drugs. She had, she was ignored as a child. She was the youngest, and so no one really paid her attention. She's out being promiscuous with all these different men, connecting to them for some sort of attention, thinking it's love. So I wrote my book in a way that it felt like you were there experiencing it. I wanted you to feel like you were a part of the story. I wanted to give you an opportunity to connect with the characters and have emotional attachments to what you were reading. So the whole trajectory of my story changed once I learned her story. That it wasn't just a tell-all book. It was a film, to me, a film in writing. And so that's kind of where the title came from. And right now I'm working on part 2.
That's amazing. Wow. What a journey. And
Yeah.
it sounds really awesome that your mom was willing to sit down and tell you her story.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, did she know about her mother's story? Was she able to give you insight into her mother, or was your grandmother available to tell her story?
So what I realized in this process was my mother wasn't willing to tell me everything at first. It took a lot of prying, a lot of, trying to convince her of how much I needed her to tell me her story. And so part 1, that was kind of like the holdup, is I wasn't able to put everything because her healing process came at her own time. So
Right.
when she was ready to give me certain details, that I was able to write it. And so her healing, her beginning to heal, allow her to feel more free to share it. But her mother and her doesn't have a good relationship. They don't have the type of relationship to where they share those things. And the reason why I knew my grandmother went through abuse is because my grandmother raised me as a child, for most of my young child life. And I just remember her telling me some of the horror stories about some of the things that she suffered. And so that's why I have knowledge of some of my grandmother's abuse. But the toxic relationship that her and her daughter has, it was a relationship that was passed down between me and my mother. And that's when I learned like what it was my grandmother didn't feel protected by her mother. My mother didn't feel protected by hers, and I didn't feel protected by mine. So it was like this never ending cycle of just being passed down, of just bitterness and toxic relationships. And so I think that my mother and my grandmother will one day have that conversation. And I believe it will be freeing for the both of them. And they're making small steps, but I feel like there's a lot of work that does need to be done. So I think that once my mother sit down and actually hear the depths of my grandmother's story, I think that it will be awesome and freeing for both of them. But my mother still has some things that she hasn't come to liberty to share. But I feel like as she continue to grow and make the decisions to heal, and not fear. Because one thing that I do want people to know is everyone has a past. Everyone
Yep.
has mistakes that they've made. Everyone has some sort of abuse. And whether you believe in heaven or hell, God doesn't rank one sin higher than the other. He doesn't say, oh, well, you did this, so you get the hottest part of hell, while this person, you know, you get
Right.
just a little, a little candle flame. I believe that if you believe that hell is for one person, it's for everybody. So one thing I had to tell my mother was, it's not about your past. God gave us all a unique story. Sometimes parts of that story is horrible and we don't want to share, and some parts are great. But nobody can judge you for what you've done. And I believe there will be power when an abuser speaks out and say, I was an abuser. I made these decisions. I did these things, because then you give other abusers the freedom to know that, one, they can be changed. Two, they can walk away from those decisions. And three, that it's possible. But if you have all these people who's not willing to divulge and share their stories, then you have a bunch of people that's trapped in bondage. And so I told my mother, there's some young girl that made the same decisions that are making them now that you made at 14, that needs to hear your story so that she could say, okay, so it's not just me, and I see you, so I can come out and do the same thing. And so
Right.
once we had that conversation, I believe that she started to see that there's power in your testimony. There's power. There's more power in speaking out your testimony than it is holding it and trying to pretend to be somebody that you're not.
Mm, 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 mm. Yeah, your mother was 14. She was a child.
Yeah.
She was a
Yeah.
child, and then she brought a child into the world, and then her
Mhm.
mother had to raise another child.
Yeah.
Right. So, she was raising two children that she had to take care of. And I could
Yeah.
see how that might have caused some strife in the relationship, and how there might have been some strife before you were even considered, right?
Oh,
Because
yeah.
of what your grandmother had gone through and what your mother had witnessed. But I imagine your grandmother had similar experience with her mother, and it just we pass that stuff down. But you're right, telling the story, we can end that cycle of abuse, that generational trauma. We can bring it to light. And what you described earlier about the kind of like that voice of, well, I can't tell my story because that's not going to pay my bills, that's a shame. Right? That's a shame talking. And when I say I know that, I understand shame. Shame is like that annoying neighbor that complains about everything and makes you want to feel like that you just need to give up and move, right? When they don't want you nearby. It's that background noise that wants to be louder. And shame is what drives people into addiction and to pain and chaos. So, telling our stories is what is necessary at this point. And I'm grateful that you've been able to tell your story, and that you're helping people in your family tell their stories, even if it is just a little bit at a time.
Yeah.
So where do you see your story going? Because you have a great trailer on your website. This is like a setup for a film. Now, do you have a film in the works?
So the thing is, so when I was writing my book, I told you I wanted it to be on television. And when God told me to write my story, I immediately went to, I don't want to write a book. I just want it to be a film. Like, I want to sit down. I want to tell somebody my story. I want them to write it. And then I want it to be a film. And then I realized the impact of me telling my story personally. And my goal is for it to be a TV series. But I had to share my story, and I don't know the direction that God's going to take it as far as the way that the audience speak to it. But I've said over and over again on my social media how much I would love to work with Viola Davis and Juvie Productions. Yeah, I think that would just be so dope and so awesome. And I've even sent her a book. And so if I have to send her a book every month until she decides to read it, that's my goal. But my goal, so my trailer was made to try and create a conversation around people wanting to see it as a film. I believe that, one, I invested everything into this film. I invested everything into the film, into doing what I truly believe that God called me to do. I believe there's power in finding your purpose. And so my goal would be to see this as a TV series, whether it's me coming up with the resources and the funds to film it myself and hire my own director and my own cast or whatever. But I would love to work with someone because I believe there's going to be power in this for generations to come, and it will have a global impact. So I would want to get around someone who I believe is already a trailblazer for having taboo conversations. And I think Viola Davis is her strength, and her boldness is something that I just admire. You know, when she tells stories and when she's a part of stories, she don't try to cookie cut it, you know, to fit some type of mold. She's willing to speak out. And my concern would be to just get with someone who wants to get with someone who wants to take away from my story. Like
Right.
I don't want to partner with someone who wants to take certain pieces away because it's not good for TV. I want someone who's willing to tell the uncut truth, because that's where the power lies. People can't get saved from my perfection. They can't get saved from the cute parts. I want to tell the deep and dark, ugly parts of my story, because that's what people can connect to. When you tell the deep and nasty parts, like in my book, I warn people under 18 to not read it, or if you're not a high school senior, because I do talk about sex. I talk about drug usage. I talk about all of that because God gave me a wonderful story, and who am I to hold parts of it in my hand because I feel like it's not good enough for the world to see. So my hopes is to get a TV series. I'm going to continue to work, continue to pray, continue to stand behind that vision for it to be a TV series. And Viola Davis is my first pick, but anyone is willing to tell my story and that can find a connection with my story, I'm willing to work with. It's not about the money. It's not about the fact she's already famous, but I fell in love with her characters that she played, and just her as a woman from the first film that I saw her in the first TV show. So that's my goal, and that's what I'm looking forward to. I think that I have something great. I believe that the way that I'm willing to tell my story, it hasn't been told this way. It hasn't been done this way. So I believe that I'm the trailblazer for this conversation. So I'm waiting for the right person to see it. I don't care about followers and views. And it takes one good eye and one good ear to hear and see what I'm doing for impact to be able to be made. So I just need somebody to believe in my story.
I believe in your story. I mean, this is so powerful. And, you know, Viola Davis, I'll tell you this, and I haven't told many people this. She's like my pretend mother. You know, I just love that one. I love that woman. Oh my goodness. She just embodies so much hope and courage and bravery and strength. And I just love her. Her and Angela Bassett. Fearless. If I could merge the two of them, oh my goodness. And you know, I think she is the trailblazer, right? And so if anyone could tell your story, it is her for sure.
And I'm telling you, I've already saw that.
Yes, and you keep sending her a book.
Oh, I am.
That's a great idea. I can send her a book too.
Yeah, I said I'm gonna keep sending and keep reaching out. I tag her, you know, on social media, and I send her my stuff. But I believe that the way has already been made. We just walking it out. So. Right. God didn't tell me to do this for nothing. He gave me a purpose. He told me to do it. So my only concern is making sure that in every room I enter, I'm a reflection of him. And that's my purpose, and everything else will follow. So I stand truly behind my faith. And I truly believe in what he has me doing. And sometimes I do get discouraged. Sometimes I'm like, I don't see the vision anymore. But I just have to continue to stand by it and just continue to believe what he spoke to me years ago, and wait till it happens. But I believe that this will be a TV series. There's no question about it. It's just the who.
Yeah, right. Absolutely. I think one thing that we have to talk about is the fact that you are a female, you're a Black female survivor. Yeah. And a lot of Black females and a lot of Black people in general, or people in color, do not want to tell their stories because we already have the history of not being believed. Yeah. Right. And so what do you think that impact, being a Black female survivor, will have on the community?
I think it will have a freeing impact. I believe that it will, it's not, so when I say I want to be seen, it's not to be seen so that I could be, you know, seen as famous or popular or gain followers. I want to be seen on a global platform so that all Black people can see someone, because I feel like there's about the same amount of Black men that have been abused that's never spoken out. Right. And I had the ability to meet a Black man that had, you know, that's been bound by his secrets. And so I believe that for the Black community, we can point out all the different issues that, you know, other people place on our culture, other people do to us as a whole. We could talk about the racism. We could talk about the, you know, the opportunities not being had. And all those are great conversations and they need to be had. But I feel like change starts from within. Yeah. And in the Black community, abuse is it's like it occurs so much that it becomes second nature to us. It's like we're just used to it.
It's normalized.
The abuse, yeah, it's so normalized in our community to where, oh, your cousin touched you, it's okay, it happens to everybody. Just stay away from him. Or your mother talks to you crazy, your mother, you know, she belittles you, it's okay, it happens. That's just be tough, you know, you need to have more courage. Yeah, and then if you are a parent who doesn't do that to your child, you're spoiling them. You need to do. So I feel like the problem is within us. And if we can identify one of the most aggressive problems, I believe there's other problems from within, but I feel like I have to tackle the one I have knowledge, and that's the abuse. It occurs so much that I believe once we begin to tackle that, we can have a strong epicenter as a whole and as a community to where we're able to fight against outside influence. We're able to fight against outside attacks. But if we only continue to look at them and not look in the mirror, I believe we will never grow and advance as a community. When we are able to tackle, you know, because there's more problems than abuse. There's problems with drug use, there's drug sale. It's so many different issues that we prefer to be uneducated. We think school is a waste of time. And in my personal opinion, I'm not saying that college is the greatest thing, but it depends on the career you want. We look at police officers and judges and lawyers, and we think that they're against us. But why haven't we begun to educate ourselves to take over those systems? And so I think that with dealing with abuse and something that I'm knowledgeable about, I want to tackle that problem. And I believe that God will send trailblazers for every other issue, but I believe tackling that problem, it will stop our children from having to grow up as victims and try to find a way to overcome the abuse that they went through. I'm not saying that abuse will not happen, because there's other forms of abuse, but my thing is the sexual abuse. I was abused by mostly every man that I know in my family, besides like cousins, but every grown man that was supposed to be above me or influenced in some way, I was abused by them. And so for me, had I been exposed or told about trauma, or I felt safe to talk about it with somebody, I would have talked about it, and it probably would have never happened in the extent that it did. But because I didn't feel safe, because my mother was so numb to abuse because she had been through it, that she wasn't trying to hear what I had been through. So I believe once we began, she was numb to it because she still hadn't dealt with her pain. So there was no emotion attached to it, because that's how she was treated when she told her mother about abuse. So I believe once we can tackle this conversation in the computer, which is why I feel like it needs to be a film, because it will reach more people. And the generation that we live in, a lot of people don't read. They will see a nice book, a nice cover, and they won't pick it up and read it, even if it's something they need to hear. But people will sit down and watch a TV series and wait for the next episode. So I believe that that's the generation that we're in. We're in a generation to where it's about social media. People are on social media. People are watching, you know, since the shutdown, TV series on Hulu and Amazon, and people don't feel safe coming out. And so television is kind of taken over. And so I believe that I will be able to reach a lot more people once that happens.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I hope that the person who needs to hear this in order to get it on the screen hears it.
Me too. Me too, bro.
It's a powerful story to tell, and you're telling it. And you just told the first part, right? There's so much more to tell, right?
I'm telling you now, the second book, if you read the first book, it's like I eased you on into it. I'm telling you. And a lot of people are light readers, so I wanted to get them hooked with like a small book. I didn't want to write it too big, because people get intimidated. People get intimidated by it. So I gave you a little taste, but the second book, it hits pretty hard. And I didn't hold back any punches.
Okay, so tell us where can we get your book, and when will the second book be out, and tell us about where to find you on social media.
Okay, my Instagram is I am Janitta Nichols, and my website is the same. It's JANITTA NICHOLS.com, JanittaNichols.com. And there you can find my book, The Secrets of My Mother. You can also find it by clicking the link in my bio on my Instagram. The second book, I am looking to put it on pre-order in the spring. I'm looking to hopefully have it on pre-order in the spring, which gives people enough time to kind of digest and read the first one. But if the spring doesn't have, at least before June, I'm looking to at least put out the second book. I was hoping to be picked up before then so that people have to wait for the second book. But if God, if God says it's not the time yet, then I'm definitely looking to do that in early spring or early spring.
Okay, awesome. Well, I strongly encourage my listeners to go to Janitta's website, her Instagram, and click on the links to get to the YouTube, and I'll have all those in the show notes.
Thank you.
The trailer is powerful, and I think that the world will be waiting for you to have that film and that or that
Thank you.
series. Yeah, we're gonna be waiting.
You.
Yes.
Thank you. I appreciate it so much.
Thank you for coming on the show and being so transparent and open about your struggles and your survival. I applaud anyone who is able to open themselves up and be vulnerable. And I think that's what we need more in the world. We need more vulnerability. We need more healing, because you have to be vulnerable in order to heal. And I think what the negative messages that we have received is that it's not okay to be vulnerable. It's not safe to be vulnerable. So then you shut down and hold it all inside, and then it comes out sideways. So thank you for being another person who is willing to come forward and say, hey, I'm a survivor too.
Yeah. And just to, let's say one last thing. When I was telling my story from a place of trying to remain safe, people couldn't connect with me. They couldn't connect with my story. But the moment that I was vulnerable and I was willing to bare my soul for the sake of saving someone else, I believe that that's when the connection began, and people were able to really see that, she loves and she stands behind, and there's power to her message. It's not just words on a page. It's not just another abuse story. It's not just a yay, me too type of conversation. But when I was able to be vulnerable and bare my soul, and I put my heart behind what it was that I was saying in my writing, and I was willing to expose every part of my story, I believe that that's when the biggest impact began to be made. And I was able to see the difference in the stories that was sent to me in my Instagram after interviews. And oh my God, thank you so much for sharing your story. You definitely spoke to parts of my life. And so that's when I realized I have to continue to be vulnerable. I have to continue to allow that to occur, because that's the only way people are going to be saved. So definitely, that's an awesome word to use. So I thank you for allowing me your platform to tell my story and to share, parts about myself. And I hope that I was able to, encourage someone. And I'm always open for DMs and messages. I'm not Hollywood to where, oh, don't write me, don't ask me questions, just listen. So I'm here for anyone who feels like they want that release and don't know where to begin. They can definitely feel free to, send me a message on there. But if they don't have social media, I can also be reached at JanittaNichols@gmail.com.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much. And you're welcome back anytime.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much. And you have an awesome day and a happy new year.
You too.
All right.
Thank you for joining me for another episode of Journey On. I hope this story will help you on your healing journey. I want to hear from you. Leave me a message at anchor.fm/journeynonpod/message, and I might be able to respond to you on a future episode. Tweet me at @TheDJBurr. Follow me on Instagram at @TheDJBurr. Like the Journey On Facebook page at facebook.com/journeynonpod, and join our survivor community at facebook.com/journeynonsurvivors. Till next time. The music in this episode is by Condewit, Matthew Ortega. Learn more at www.condewit.com. That's conduit.com.